Hi, well, thank you very much for taking the time to watch these videos. So this is the Talking Sense, Understanding My Senses Training. It's a guide for young people. And this is part one. I hope you enjoy it and find it useful. So in this presentation, we're going to talk about the following things. First of all, we're going to actually think, well, what does sensory processing actually mean? And then also, why do we need to know about it? There's going to be quite a lot of information about our brain, and we're going to think about different ways that our brain uses information from the sensors. And we'll be talking about this in more detail in the following presentations, and we'll keep building on this information and this knowledge. So just to say, this presentation is designed really for young people of high school age, but some younger children might benefit from it, but we'd very much recommend that you work through the different units with an adult. So if they've got any questions or any bits that they don't understand, that there's an adult there who can answer those questions. So I just wanted to start off saying a little bit about myself. So when I was growing up, I had a really hard time just doing everyday things, handwriting, PE, joining in with playground games, paying attention, even just standing still were things that were really, really tricky for me. And I just couldn't understand why I had such a hard time doing these things. Nobody else seemed to be finding it difficult at all. And it didn't make me feel good about myself, and it didn't make me feel like I fitted in. But then when I became an occupational therapist and studied sensory processing, I realized that it wasn't that I was stupid or weird. It's just that my brain needs more help to sort out those messages from my senses. But I also found out there's loads of things that can be done to help it out. I really wish that I'd known all of these things when I was younger, and that makes me want to really help you understand your senses, and how you can make them work for you. So we're going to start with a little bit of a quiz. So it's just, again, if you want to just pause and have a think through all of these things. So you can always just pause the presentation and just look at the slide. So did you struggle with any of these things when you were younger, or do you still find these things difficult now? Yes or no? So I could never play sports or join in with PE as well as my friends. Yes or no? I was always tripping and falling. I found it really hard to pay attention and not to daydream. I hated eating certain things or trying new foods. Being in noisy or busy places made me feel really stressed. I hated wearing certain clothes or certain kinds of fabric. I hated having to have a shower or to wash my hair. I was terrified of climbing high or falling over. I like to keep my feet really firmly on the ground. I was too scared to try horse riding or bike riding as the movement just seemed way too fast. I could never sit still no matter how hard I tried. So all of the questions in this quiz are about something called sensory processing. So if, like me, you ticked a lot of those boxes with yes, this is something that you need to know more about, and this presentation is here to tell you more. So if we think about what sensory processing means, the word sensory just means anything which is linked to our senses. So that's sight, smell, touch, taste, and hearing. And the word processing means sorting out and organising. So we're going to think a little bit about the senses. So we have 5 regular senses and 3 special senses which pick up messages from our body and also the world all around us. And these messages are sent to our brain so that we know what's happening. And absolutely millions of messages are sent to the brain every second of every day. So we cannot pay attention to millions of sensory messages, so the brain sorts them out for us. So it has a sensory sieve which filters out things which are not important. And it also flags up really important sensory messages which need our urgent attention. So here are some examples of how our brain might sort out the messages that it's getting from our senses. So it might see some messages as urgent, some as useful, and some as unhelpful. So an urgent message would be to see a car speeding towards us as we were crossing the road. We'd need to do something about that straight away and leap out of the way. A useful message would be to spot a friend in the crowd if we're meeting somebody and we need to find them. A not very helpful message would be seeing tiny little bits of fluff on the carpet. And again, if we think about our touch sense, an urgent message would be feeling a severe pain. We might need to do something straight away. We might need to go to the hospital or to the doctor. A useful message will be feeling there's a stone in our shoe. We need to take it out before we get a blister or get a cut on our foot. But an unhelpful message is feeling clothes brushing against our skin all the time, all through the day. And then the last example for sorting out messages is one to do with sound. So an urgent message would be if we heard a smoke alarm sounding when there's a fire. We need to do something about that straight away. We need to get out of the building or get to a place of safety. A useful message is hearing an important announcement, so we know what it is that we're supposed to be doing. But an unhelpful message is hearing the traffic noise outside if that's not something that we need to pay attention to. So everybody's brain is different, and sometimes the sensory sieve works really well. Sometimes it doesn't work really well, and this is what can happen. So if too many sensory messages are filtered out, we don't have all of the information that we need. So we've got gaps where little bits of the puzzle and little bits of important information are missing. So that means that it's really hard to understand what's happening and what we need to do. And it's also hard to tell how our body is feeling. If not enough sensory messages are filtered out, we'll just become really overwhelmed with too much information. We can feel really worried and stressed. It's hard to concentrate on anything, and we can feel unable to cope. And again, just like our electronic devices, our brain can go into standby mode, or it can shut down completely if it receives too many messages all at once. So just thinking a little bit more about the brain. So we've got 3 different layers in our brain. There is the thinking brain, and this is the modern top layer of the brain, which carries out all our complicated thinking and learning. Then we have the middle bit of the brain, and that's the emotional brain. It's very powerful, and it is there primed and ready to keep us safe. It's constantly scanning the messages from our sensors for any danger or threat. Our last layer of the brain is the reptile brain. And this is an ancient brain which is constantly working in the background. So it looks after body functions which keep us alive. So things like breathing, our heart beating without us having to think about them. And our senses have a very strong influence on our emotional brain. So not only does our brain have to filter the sensory messages, it also has to work out what the messages mean. It has to decide what needs to be done about the messages. And then also it needs to communicate with our body and send a message to tell our body what to do and how to move. Each part of the brain has a slightly different job to do. So here are just some of the things that our brain does. It keeps our body movements well coordinated. It helps us to plan things. And again, different bits of our brain operate certain parts of our body. So there's a part of the brain that operates the eyes, a part that operates the ears. So although each part of the brain has its own special job, it also works as a team with the rest of the brain. And this helps to keep our body running really smoothly. So our brain is made up of tiny building blocks called neurons or brain cells. And brain cells are long and have branches like a tree at each end, which help them to connect to each other. And our brain cells link together so that messages are quickly passed from one part of our brain to another. The messages travel like little electrical impulses along this network of brain cells. So the long stem of the nerve cell is covered in a special coating, which helps the message to travel smoothly and quickly. And we can think of sensory messages being like trains traveling along train tracks. So if we think of the sensory messages being a little bit like trains traveling along a train track, then the brain is a bit like a huge train station. So the brain has to direct and coordinate all the sensory information at trains as they arrive at the platforms. It has to send them to the right place, to the right platform, and it has to connect them with other incoming trains. Some messages need to come off the trains, some need to stay on to be sent back down to the body. So, but actually, our brain is not just a train station, it's also an airport and a ferry terminal, as it has to manage messages from both inside the body, outside the body, and also messages from our memories, our emotions. So I think the thing to think about here is that this is a very, very complicated process. Everything is coming in all at once from every direction. And if just one part is too fast, too slow, too strong or too weak, then the messages are not going to connect properly and things will start to go wrong. So if things start to go wrong, this is a little bit like a brain train crash. And brain train crashes happen when the timing of messages isn't quite right, it's a little bit off, or if maybe the nerve networks are a bit too rough or not very strong, they're a little bit weak. So the brain has a tiny fraction of a second to respond to most situations. There's really no time to think about it. Sensory messages can get mixed up or lost if this happens. And when our brain train crashes, our body often doesn't know what to do. So our senses have to be very strong and robust before we can build and develop our physical skills and our brain, our school thinking skills. So we can think of this a little bit like building a house. So at the bottom, we've got the basement or the foundations, which is our senses. On the ground floor, this is where we can then build our physical skills. In the first floor, we've got brain skills. And then in the loft, we've got school skills. So school skills are the trickiest of all, and they come after our senses. Physical skills and brain skills are all in place. And if we can find new ways to help our senses out, we'll find that this can help us out in lots of different ways. So we might improve our PE skills or learning skills as well. So we've introduced lots of different bits of information in this presentation. So we've said that sensory processing is what happens when messages from our senses reach the brain. And unhelpful messages are ignored, and very important messages are flagged for our immediate attention. So it's a little bit like we've got a sieve in our brain that does this for us. So our emotional brain works very closely with our senses to keep a lookout for possible danger around us. We've said as well, sensory messages travel along brain cells, a little bit like trains on a busy rail network, and everything needs to travel at the right speed, on the right track, to the right destination. And if the timing's wrong or things get a bit mixed up, it's a bit like a brain train crash. So our body won't know what to do. It hasn't got the right information at the right time. So the last thing that we've looked at in this presentation is that strong senses give us the foundation we need to build other life skills. It's a bit like the basement of a house. And helping out our senses can also help out our physical PE skills and our school skills. So in the next section, we're going to look in a little bit more detail at the different senses. So this session and all of these sessions are inspired by the book, The Sensory Team Handbook by Nancy Mucklow.